It can't be tomorrow. We know it can't be tomorrow.
SCOTUS blog says Monday is the next decision day.
Okay. Because they had the option to do Friday,
yes.
But they're not taking it.
For
They're
whatever
reason,
off. SCOTUS blog said tomorrow, no. Monday, yes.
I hope they take a mental health day. Maybe it's their mental health day.
Honestly, I need a mental health day. So thank you, Supreme Court.
Well, we can't take a mental health day because we have to tape Sound Politics.
Thanks a lot, Kat.
You're listening to Sound Politics. I'm Scott Greenstone.
And I'm Libby Denkmann. And Scott, the August primary is more than 5 weeks away, but overseas and military ballots are actually already in the mail.
Crazy.
I cannot believe it's already here. And today on Sound Politics, we're going to talk about voting, specifically how right-wing election skepticism and President Trump's war on vote by mail is threatening to upend this system of mail-in voting that we have here in Washington state.
Yeah, or at least mess with it. And we have some really big updates on this front. First, we're going to talk about a case the U.S. Supreme Court could decide next week that could force a small but potentially important change here in Washington. And then we'll talk about an executive order from the president himself that could have a way more dramatic impact in our state if the Postal Service ends up going through with it. That order is tied up in the courts right now, and it is unclear how things will shake out.
Yeah, if you can't tell, there has been an absolute flurry of voting news this week.
Writing the script is just like new headlines coming in, change that, change this.
Yeah, like in the past 24 hours, multiple updates. So by the time you hear this, things may have changed. But we live in the moment. We got to talk about where things stand right now, and we're going to do that after a break. From KUOW in Seattle, this is Sound Politics. I'm Libby Denkmann here with Scott Greenstone. And
hey.
Scott, first up, let's talk about this SCOTUS decision that is imminent, the Supreme Court of the United States.
Yes.
You have dug into this potential ruling some. What does this case from Mississippi have to do with us here in Washington and our vote-by-mail system?
Yeah, so the case is called Watson v. RNC. That's Republican National Committee suing the Mississippi Secretary of State, Michael Watson, over a practice allowing ballots in Mississippi that are received after Election Day, but which were postmarked by Election Day to be counted. So Washington State and a dozen others allow this, right? If you vote on Election Day, if you get your ballot in the mail on Election Day and it was postmarked by Election Day, it can still count. So it's called this grace period, right? A ruling in this case could affect ballot counting in this state and all those other states that allow this grace period. I called a UW law professor named Danielle Evans. So with her help, I'm going to do a 20-second crash course on election law. Are you ready?
Okay, buckle up.
So the Constitution says, in very simple terms, according to Evans,
states have the power to determine the time, place, and manner of elections, except when Congress steps in and creates rules that override state rules.
Note here, Congress, not the president. That'll become important in a second. So what kind of rules might Congress step in and override states on, you ask, right?
Yes, that's my question. Yes, go ahead. Please answer that question.
Well, one might be setting federal election day. So we all elect the president and Congress on the Tuesday after the first Monday in November, right? That's an important one, maybe. And therein lies the question of this case. Is Election Day the day you cast your ballot, or the day election officials receive it? Because in a state like Washington, right, you might cast your ballot, get it postmarked by Election Day. Election officials might not get it in the mail till a week later.
Yeah. So this question has obviously been a bigger deal since the pandemic, when more states started to move towards this vote by mail system. Like Mississippi expanded its vote by mail rules during the pandemic. So this is getting to be a bigger and bigger issue.
Yeah. And, as a reminder, Washington's elections have been mail-in much longer than the pandemic.
Yeah.
But back to the Supreme Court case, plaintiffs in the case, and a lot of Republicans in Washington state as well, argue that a ballot should not be counted if it's postmarked by Election Day but isn't received until after Election Day. Mississippi allows a grace period of 5 days. Other states only allow like 1 day, or some do 10 days. Here in Washington, we allow up to 21 days after a general election day, which is the longest grace period in the country.
Oh, wow.
And critics don't want those late arriving ballots to be counted. They kind of, often criticize how dragged out some elections are because we don't know the results sometimes for weeks.
Yeah, we're going to
after.
get to some of that.
Totally,
for sure.
yeah. But people who like vote by mail, including some Republicans as well in the state, say limiting these grace periods means rural or military voters could get their votes thrown out when the post office is slow.
So the Supreme Court is expected to rule on that question, that grace period for ballots that are postmarked before the election is over, before Election Day ends, and arrive after Election Day. We are taping this on Thursday when we're talking right now. This decision could be as early as Monday.
Yeah.
So what's the potential impact here, Scott?
Probably if they decide Election Day is the day ballots get received, anything received after that would get thrown out. So if you think about the last federal election in Washington state, which was November 2024, right? Around 127,000 votes came in after Election Day statewide. That sounds like a lot, and those would all get thrown out, right? It's not a ton when you consider that nearly 4 million people voted in that election. But for that 127,000 people, obviously that's important. That's the size of, I don't know, a small city.
Yeah, definitely.
So if the conservative Supreme Court or the conservative justices on the Supreme Court, they are very skeptical of mail-in ballots. That's something we learned during oral arguments in March. If they kill the grace period for counting late ballots, I think that here in Washington state, election officials would probably be doing more of what they've been doing, telling people to vote early and use ballot boxes instead of mailboxes to drop off ballots. That is something that they've been saying in Washington to voters for years. If it's a week or less until the election and you haven't voted yet, don't leave it to chance. Don't put it in the mail. Go to a ballot box. And King County is looking at installing something like 8 more ballot boxes in more rural parts of the county.
To give people more options so they don't have to just rely on the mail.
Or drive all the way to the nearest city or whatever.
Yeah.
It is unclear right now to me how this would affect our August primary that we mentioned at the top, right? The one coming up soon, because that is not a federal election. It is a primary, which is governed by different rules.
So we have seen some high-profile examples of when these election results feel like they drag out. They take
totally.
forever to come in because of this extra time allowance. Again, the ballot's postmarked by the end of Election Day, but they don't arrive for days afterwards. Seattle Mayor Katie Wilson's election last fall is one example.
Great example.
Remember
yes.
watching those returns coming in and kind of seeing a trend towards Wilson, and it was a very tight race between her and Bruce Harrell, and she ends up winning by like 2,000 votes. And so all of that was very suspenseful. People, watching as the late arriving ballots got tallied. I mean, LA's mayoral race has kicked up a ton of conspiracy theories on the right about Spencer Pratt and the fact that, he was in a good position to move forward in the top 2 primary when Election Day was over. But then the late arriving ballots in LA, as they do in Seattle, they typically trend progressive. And so Nithya Raman ends up pulling it out. Here in Washington state, the head of our local Republican Party, State Representative Jim Walsh, is a loud voice against this late ballot counting. He wrote in a column on a conservative website last week that he thinks Washington should stop allowing the late arriving ballots, even if they're postmarked on time, claiming that there aren't enough checks in our voting system to make sure that ballots are sent to the right people. He says that there aren't enough safeguards against fraud in the system, though he doesn't provide strong evidence to back up his claims. And, frankly, I don't personally see why the security for late arriving ballots would be any different from the ballots that arrive by Election Day. They get the same signature check, et cetera.
Yeah.
We should say voter fraud does happen, but it is super rare. And we just don't have evidence of this widespread fraud that is cited again and again by President Trump and his allies.
The Seattle Times pointed out that the Heritage Foundation has documented something like 1,600 cases of voter fraud since 1982.
Yeah.
In the last 44 years.
Like nationally?
Nationally,
oh my
something
gosh.
like 16. That's the Heritage Foundation.
Yeah. Still, Jim Walsh and people like him are skeptical of mail-in ballots. They think that the ballots should get counted by Election Day. End of story.
Yeah. And on the other side of the argument, right, proponents of voting grace periods, the people, the Watsons in Watson v. RNC, or a lot of people around here, a lot of Democrats especially, they say that this system increases voter turnout and helps make sure we get all the votes counted from, like I mentioned, rural areas where the mail is slower. In 2024, almost 7,500 of those votes that I mentioned earlier that would have gotten thrown out, that were received after Election Day, 7,500 of those votes were from military and overseas voters. So changing the rules could disenfranchise them.
Or just make it more difficult for them to vote. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyway, that is the Supreme Court. We promised we were also going to talk about this other really important part of the push against mail-in voting, which is coming from President Trump. Like we mentioned, more states have expanded mail-in voting since 2020. Trump is still really committed to this idea that the 2020 election was stolen. And I should say idea. It's an unproven false idea that the 2020 election was stolen and mail-in voting was part of that. The president's been trying to get states to hand over voter rolls. He's been trying to get Congress to pass his Save America Act, which would require voter ID to cast a ballot in federal elections. In fact, he has had so little success with getting that through Congress that he actually canceled on Wednesday the signing of a huge bipartisan housing bill that he had called for as something that Democrats and Republicans actually agree on. Imagine that in this time, because he said he's not going to sign it until Congress passes the Save America Act.
Which they don't have the votes for. They don't have votes to override the veto. And congressional Republicans are frankly disappointed because they were hoping to talk about the housing bill in the midterms.
Right. They wanted to say, we got to win. Hey, so the president, unable to get at vote by mail through those avenues, has turned his attention to the mail itself, or specifically the people who deliver it. He's been trying to institute national voting rules through the Postal Service, first with an executive order and now potentially by trying to stop the flow of ballots. This week, the Postmaster General said during a Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee that if a state doesn't comply with the Postal Service's new rules, really the president's new rules around mail-in voting, that the Postal Service will not deliver mail-in ballots.
Yeah, but this morning, Thursday, just a few hours before we are speaking right now, over in Boston, there was a federal judge who blocked key parts of this order from taking effect before the November election. The Trump administration is absolutely going to try to fight this decision. That's going to go back and forth in the courts. But that's where things stand as of this morning, as we are taping this episode on Thursday. And there's still plenty of questions swirling about the limits that Trump wants to put on how the Postal Service handles ballots. So we want to talk through all of this with Washington State Standard reporter Jake Goldstein-Street, who is reporting on this situation. Jake, welcome to Sound Politics.
Thanks for having me.
So for now, it appears that the president's March executive order is on hold because of this ruling out of Boston. But while this legal fight plays out, just can you talk to us about what was the order trying to do?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it is a bit murky. So this is an executive order from the end of March, and it does a couple things. For one, it tells the Department of Homeland Security to make a list of citizens. And then it also tells the Postal Service to get lists of all eligible voters. The relation between those two isn't made super clear in the order, but there were concerns and some confirmation, at least from Homeland Security, that the list would be sort of cross-referenced to root out non-citizen voters who, we should note, are few and far between, but have been pretty core to President Trump's theories of voter fraud. And then there were concerns also from Democrats, voting rights groups, that this endeavor could lead to eligible voters, people who should have the right, being stripped of their rights wrongfully. The order also opened the door to prosecuting election officials who don't comply. And so to implement that order, you have the Postal Service recently proposing the rule that you're talking about. This rule would force states to send in their voter lists to the Postal Service so that they have a list of who ballots should go to. But and the Postal Service says they won't touch the list, won't change them. But if the states don't send them, as you said, then the Postal Service won't send the ballots. And as you said, the postmaster confirmed this week. This would, completely upend voting in an all-mail ballot state like Washington. if you no longer have the Postal Service to rely on to send ballots. The rule has some other conditions, like including a new federal barcode on ballots, but obviously the main concern has been the voter list. And it's just the latest way the Trump administration has been seeking to get voter rolls across the country. And this case will continue to develop, but there's no sense that the ruling today would stop the president from trying other avenues to try to get these voter lists.
Yeah. Yeah. So like we mentioned yesterday, the Postmaster General told Congress the Postal Service wouldn't deliver mail-in ballots in states that don't comply with what Trump wants to do. So I reached out to Washington Attorney General Nick Brown for a comment on this, and his statement emailed back to me was, the Postal Service has no authority to undermine free and fair elections, and it's a disgrace that they'd even suggest it. We strongly condemn any effort to deny voters their rights and are already in court challenging the executive order this rule intends to implement. And they are. They sued with nearly 24 other states in April. So we talked earlier about what the Constitution says about what states can decide about elections and what Congress can decide about elections. But the Postal Service is a whole other thing. Jake, from what you understand, is this something the post office can do at the president's behest, like mess around with mail-in voting?
No, I mean, up to this point, the Postal Service, obviously have been, completely nonpartisan and is just sending the mail out to people to get their ballots. This is, completely unprecedented. The Constitution only talks about the states and Congress having power over elections, not the executive branch where the president is or an independent federal agency like the Postal Service. So this is, as I said, unprecedented.
Jake, what have you heard from the Secretary of State here in Washington, Steve Hobbs, who manages our elections? How is he responding to this, and what's his reasoning?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of concern from Secretary of State here and elsewhere that this would, cause chaos. And, it's worth noting we're only a few months out from the midterms. To implement a pretty complicated and new rule like this to get all of these voter lists would be a pretty hefty task for the states and the federal government. And he's, Hobbs sees it basically as we were talking about with the constitutionality, that it's, federal overreach. It could potentially undermine the rights of eligible voters and overriding the state's authority. The point there is going back to the beginning of potentially stripping rights of people that are otherwise eligible when you're searching for these non-citizen voters who, again, there aren't, that is not a widespread issue by any means.
He did hand over, though, Hobbs, some voter information, right? Like, how did he kind of decide, or did you hear from him why he handed over some and not others? Like, how did he kind of parse that?
Sure. There is, publicly available information that anyone can request, including the federal government, that it would hand over. But where Hobbs has, pushed back in the past is over sensitive information like social security numbers, other things that aren't publicly available. I guess it's worth noting that the Department of Justice is filed an ongoing lawsuit against the state trying to get our voter rolls, trying to get that sensitive information. They filed these sorts of lawsuits all over the country and have basically failed unanimously all over the place. The state is looking to dismiss that lawsuit with a hearing upcoming in a couple months. So there's no reason to believe that they'll be successful there based on judges elsewhere siding with states that don't want to send over those rolls.
Even just writing this episode has been hard because there's just this crush of breaking news about voting issues right now. As ballots are like starting to go out, at least in Washington, to like overseas voters. Obviously, in states like New York, they're already having their primaries. So it could be stressful, I think, for listeners. It can be hard to keep up. How should voters handle this, Jake? Like, do you think should we plan to just use like voter drop boxes instead of the Postal Service just to be safe? What are you hearing, and how are you making sense of it as a voter yourself?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think election officials, including the Secretary of State, have been pushing folks to be using drop boxes more and to be getting their ballots in earlier. I mean, beyond the Supreme Court case that you guys have been talking about, there's also this concern that changes that the Trump administration has been making to the Postal Service generally is going to delay postmarking and force ballots not to be counted. That's important because ballots can be counted currently after the election, but as long as they're postmarked by election day. And so that can lead to it taking days and days to count votes
Right.
and thousands of ballots come in to be tabulated after election day. And so to, make sure you have the best shot to ensure that your vote is counted, they say to be using drop boxes instead of the mail. And if you do use the mail, you're going to get your ballot, a couple of weeks before the election, and you should not wait and get it in as soon as possible. King County, for example, is trying to add a bunch more of these drop boxes ahead of the election.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Jake, big picture, what are you hearing about the stakes here? I mean, this is Washington State and a number of other primarily male states who are going to bat in court against the Trump administration over who controls elections. I mean, what are the big picture potential ramifications of all of these battles?
Sure. I mean, you've got a president here who, since his loss in 2020, has been really railing against mail balloting, even though that's the form of voting that he's been using himself.
Mm-hmm.
And so, meanwhile, you've got a state like Washington, other states where that's the primary, basically the only way that you vote. And so it is sort of an existential threat to the voting system in Washington if there's really any obstacle or change to that system that's going to make it harder for people to vote. It's not like there's an easy alternative.
Jake Goldstein Street is a reporter with the Washington State Standard. Thanks, Jake.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so that was one way that voting is being challenged. The way we vote here in Washington, vote by mail, is being challenged by the Trump administration right now. This order to try to get the voting rolls and to strong-arm states into providing that information and following these new rules by basically saying the Postal Service will not deliver your ballots if you don't comply. The other challenge was the Supreme Court case that we just discussed, the Mississippi late arriving ballots and whether or not those will be allowed to be counted. We're expecting to, again, hear that ruling maybe in the next week or so. So much is happening on the voting beat, Scott. It is hard to keep up with. We tried to summarize it all here.
Yeah.
But I think, Jake just really set us up for the big picture takeaways, which are this could change the way we vote in this state. This could change the way the federal government controls elections in the future, which have traditionally been, again, left with the states.
Yes. Yeah. And Democrats have said maybe we should change that in the past. There have been movements or legislation proposed to nationalize voting,
and that's mostly because they've been trying to expand vote by mail. Exactly.
Yeah. But that's a lot different than this move to just say, hey, post office, why don't you stop delivering mail-in ballots because I don't, like them, even though, as Jake pointed out, President Trump himself voting from his home in Florida by mail. I do think, listener, you have probably seen the headlines that I have seen talking about upending mail-in voting, how these decisions could have very dire consequences. I do want to, and at least for me, on a note of caution, the sky is not falling. I was reading this piece on what Watson v. RNC, the ruling that we talked about from the beginning, or the case that we talked about in the beginning, what it would change in practice. I was reading on the Bipartisan Policy Center about what it would mean in practice. And they pointed out, and I think this is a really good thing to remember, a ruling against mail voting grace periods is not necessarily going to dramatically increase the rate at which ballots are rejected for being late. States that have and that don't have grace periods reject mail ballots for lateness at similar rates, suggesting, and this is very key, voters adapt to whatever deadline is in place.
Yeah, people adjust.
And I think that, when you hear the Secretary of State saying that this is really dire, I think some of that is politics. He is, in this state, a Democrat. And, when you ask him, okay, so what should we do? It's like he encourages you to do the same thing he's been encouraging you to do for years and other election officials, which is get your ballot in sooner. So I really just want to push against this idea that the sky is falling.
Yeah, I would say that would be the sentiment if we didn't have a president who has consistently spread false election conspiracy theories, has consistently made claims about the election being stolen when it wasn't, and in 2020 tried to overturn a free and fair election. I mean, if all of that context wasn't there, then I think that the pushback would seem a little bit more maybe overdramatic from Democrats. But this is the reality that we're living in. And so to see states standing up to the federal government, similar to the way that Georgia, even a Republican Secretary of State, in 2020, stood up to the president when, he was trying to overturn that election in Georgia and potentially swing the whole race. Like, this is sort of, has a history of states being protective of the process being not in the president's hands for good reason. And so I think that, definitely anything having to do with Trump in Washington state is going to score political points. But I do think the context there is important. We have short memories, but our memories are not that short.
I'm
right?
just realizing that I completely forgot about that phone call, right, with Raffensperger,
where
the perfect phone call where Trump said, I essentially, I just need you to give me these votes.
Just find me these votes.
Find me these votes.
Yeah.
It does I think it's a good point, Libby. It puts a lot of stress on the midterms that are coming up, right? And the question is, what is he going to do? How far is he willing to go? So far, he has mostly stood by what the courts say. There have been times when he has been kind of like ignoring them. But for the most part, he has stuck with what the courts say. So it really is going to stay, hopefully, in that arena.
I think that's it for Sound Politics today.
I think that's it for Sound Politics today. Our editor on Sound Politics is Kat Smith. Our producer is Hans Anderson. I'm Scott Greenstone.
And I'm Libby Denkmann. And truly, 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 this show is only possible because somebody just like you has decided they like the work we do here at KUOW and they're going to chip in a few bucks. And so maybe it's your turn this time around. If you appreciate this work, head on over to kuow.org/politics and make a gift. There's also a link in the show notes. And thank you so much.
See you next week.